All right, welcome to another episode of Tim Rambles On About Winemaking. We're going to talk about oxygen management right here. This is our second in the series where we've gone on with white wine, and now we're going to go ahead and look at the tools you need to make red wine. There's no tasting component involved. I just want to go through the individual things that we do in red wine that will influence the quality of our wines and sort of the timing that you would do those things. So in the broad spectrum, really looking this in the 10,000 foot view, oxygen is your friend right at inoculation because we want to be able to have some oxygen around for the yeast. Throughout fermentation with red wine, give them all the oxygen they need. I mean, there's just absolutely no reason to limit oxygen during primary fermentation. It's really hard to over-oxygenate a red wine ferment. I'm sure it's plausible, but at this point in time, it's a real place for us to do our best to provide all the things the yeast need. And so giving oxygen, whether it be through direct oxygen additions, through a venturi in our pump over, through delistage, or through pulse air, all these things are really, really good ways to bring some oxygen to the equation. Also at pressing, that's another good chance, especially if you're pressing a little before dryness, to get a little oxygen in there, help get those yeast through their final throes before they finish up. And then also, all after completion of a primary, right after we get off those lees, a little bit of oxygen is really nice because that's going to help mitigate any reductive issues that we have. So really, while you're in that fluid space between fermentation and end of primary, there's a good ability for a wine, especially red wine, a big high tannin or high phenolic component red wine, to accept oxygen. So don't be leery in those early stages. And also pre-completion of mallow. Before mallow are done, the key here with mallow is that malolactic bacteria consume acetaldehyde after they run out of malic acid. The first thing they do is eat malic acid. The next thing that they do will consume any leftover sugars, and then they'll look for another carbonyl source and they'll consume acetaldehyde. And as you've heard me talk about so often, our tannin glue is acetaldehyde. And ML, once they're done, eat it. There's none left. So it's really key to us if we want to do any tannin modification in a broader spectrum, in a macro sense, to really get it done. It's all got to be done before mallow is complete. Where oxygen is our foe after mallow. Once mallow's done, things get a little bit more tricky. We get oxygen in there, we start looking at oxidation issues. Once we add SO2, then everything's bound up. All you're going to do when you get oxygen in a wine, once SO2 is there, is you're going to bind up SO2. That acetaldehyde will react much quicker with SO2 than it will phenolics, so pretty much pointless. Also, in barrel and tank headspace, which is the worst thing ever, you do not want to leave headspace in a barrel or a tank, ever. Even in a matter of a week or two, we have acetobacter growth. I mean, I've had sterile filtered wine that I've put in a tank and sterilized the tank, and within 2 weeks, come back and open the tank, even after gassing, and seen a film of acetobacter growing on the tank. And then again, pre-bottling, right before we go to bottle, we want to get that dissolved oxygen down. Again, we're going to talk about, do a lesson on oxygen and bottling. So realistically, once we're done with mallow and sulfured, oxygen ingress needs to be at a minimum or extremely controlled in very small amounts so that the wine is accepting enough to offset reduction. That's it. So it's your friend up front, afterwards, very controlled. So during crush, I see people do all kinds of stuff beforehand. It's mostly philosophical. I don't know how much is real, but these are things I hear. I mean, the reality is polyphenol oxidase is active. There is juice browning, but you've got all the red wines around, grapes around, you can't see it. Phenols are being oxidized. We are seeing some reduction in that, but we're talking pretty small parts. And we looked at that white wine stuff where we directly oxidized white wine. We lost 10 parts of tannin. And when we're talking about a wine with 1,000 milligrams a liter, yeah, okay, 0.1% change. Perhaps it's a change. So if you want to talk about some critical control points, if you want to minimize this, use a little SO2 up front. And SO2 is important because it actually helps us extract tannins. It turns into sulfuric acid during the fermentation process. And use of SO2 up front does help in extraction. So if you're looking for a more extractive style wine, using SO2 up front is important. You would never use ascorbic. You would never really do a truly reductive style, and never ever use ascorbic acid on a red wine unless you've got some major reduction issue you can't fix. Generally, you would never use ascorbic on your reds. And then there's also this idea of adding sacrificial tannins up front, where you would throw tannins in the wine that would then oxidize and fall out or bind up with any proteins in the juice so that they would fall out. I've done trials with this and haven't seen anything that matches even remotely close to what manufacturers say. I'm not saying it does or doesn't happen. I've heard about it. I know a lot of people add, Vieira Supra and different tannins up front in order to precipitate any of these proteins early on. I tend not to believe them. And I think even, Jim Harbertson up at WSU, he's done the test too, and we just don't see any results later on. Not saying it doesn't work, because the wines do definitely taste different, but whether those differences are actually measurable remains to be seen. So some people use CO2 up front, I think mainly because it feels good, because we see it doing with white wine. It's really nice to add some CO2 to our must pump, and it looks cool. Maybe we curtail some of that polyphenol oxidase. And then there's this other idea of using CO2 snow in such a high quantity that you essentially cryomacerate. So if you can use so much CO2, and we're looking at probably 200 to 300 pounds per ton of grapes, to get the grapes cold enough that CO2 snow would shatter the berry, and then you'd get instant extraction of tannins and phenolics and color from the grapes. So there's some theory to that, and it probably would work, but your inputs are really, really high. I want to talk about cold soak, pre-fermentation, no cold soak. You just, throw the grapes in a bin and whatever. So you stem the grapes and then you pitch some yeast right away. Not much is going to happen. I mean, you've got grapes, you've got yeast you're pitching right away, and they're going to take over. And as soon as there's any ethanol in the equation, and as soon as the yeast are producing CO2, there's not going to be any browning potential in terms of clean grapes. Now, if those grapes happen to be covered in a lot of mold, you might want to use a bunch of SO2 up front to minimize any chance of lacase later on. But reality is that's a pretty rare thing to have happen. So if you've got clean grapes, destem them, maybe add a little SO2 up front to knock down any background bad bugs, and just pitch it. So really not a whole lot to worry about. However, when we get to cold soak, this is an issue. So oxygen can be a big problem during cold soak. And the reality is about cold soaks have to be cold. The number of places I go that go, we do a cold soak, and I go touch the bin and it's like 55, 60 degrees. That's not a cold soak. That's a waiting for bad things to happen problem. Now, if you're going to do a cold soak, that's great. Anthocyanins are soluble in water, whereas tannins aren't. They're soluble in ethanol. So if you want to get maximum color in a wine early on, go ahead and do a cold soak. And this may have some benefit for things like Pinot Noir and some low color varieties. Do a cold soak. But if you're going to do a cold soak, make sure it's like 40 degrees. And make sure you have the ability to warm it up when you do pitch it. Because if you've got 40-degree grapes and you pitch yeast in it, they're all going to die. So don't do that. But during a cold soak, oxygen can be a major issue. And the reality is we've got all sorts of things. We've got acetobacter, which is in every winery everywhere. We've got gluconobacter, which is in every winery everywhere. And these things make VA. We have Hansenia aspera that came in from the vineyard, which is our dominant yeast on the grapes that lives outside all year round, is adapted to warm and cold temperatures. It quite likes cold. It will actually outcompete yeast at cold temperatures, like Saccharomyces cerevisiae at cold temperatures. So Hansenia aspera will bloom in a cold soak like crazy, and it loves oxygen. It's a yeast. It loves it. And you will end up with pure fingernail polish remover in your wine. So if you're going to do a cold soak, purge and blank with CO2, use some SO2. And again, that idea of SO2 will help with tannin extraction, phenolic extraction. Unless, of course, you happen to be a winery that has so much phenolic material that you want to minimize that extraction. But we'll talk about that as we move on with red wine, practical red wine tasting. All right, so fermentation considerations with oxygen. Yeast. All right, yeast love oxygen. They will make fatty acids, which help build strong cell membranes, and realize that a fermentation is really tough. It's a difficult place for yeast to be in. And so, and the reality is that getting through a fermentation is much like climbing up a mountain. So, and the way I look at it is degrees Brix is very equivalent to climbing up Mount Everest. And so it's pretty easy for most people that are slightly well trained, which is most Saccharomyces, to get to 20, 21,000 feet, or 20 or 21, 22 Brix. But when we start getting into 25,000, 26,000, 27,000 feet, or 25, 26, 27 Brix, that's where we see a lot of fatalities and a lot of problems happen. So, and the reality is that everything it takes, the training that yeast need to be able to climb through a ferment that's that high in Brix, starts in the beginning. And it starts in the beginning by getting them well acclimated and giving them the ability to finish a fermentation. So what we want to do is give them oxygen. That'll help them make fatty acids that build their cell membrane. It'll help with their general metabolism, and they will be able to finish that fermentation better later on. So early in a ferment, once you get going, bring oxygen to the table. It's really good from a yeast kinetic standpoint. We don't really worry about tannin at this point in time. Really, really, really good for yeast. For yeast health, if you love your yeast, give them all the oxygen they need. Now, YAN is an issue in Washington. Nowhere else, not saying nowhere else, but particularly in Washington, it's a big issue. So if there's not enough nitrogen, you can walk a low YAN line through using oxygen. If you're going to do that, you're going to rehydrate your active dry wine yeast culture using oxygen up front in the inoculum. If you are going to limit your YAN, if you have low YAN and you don't want to add a whole lot, inoculate it at a really low rate. And that way you don't end up with a whole herd of yeast all trying to consume everything that's there and then leave nothing for the next generations. So what you're going to do is add a low dose of yeast and let them slowly grow, and then add oxygen to help them walk through that fermentation. And the other thing you don't want to do up front is add a bunch of DAP. Again, if you add a high inoculum and a whole bunch of DAP at the beginning, you'll create an explosion of kind of yeast that are not really well adapted to their environment. And then also, once you add DAP, the yeast ability to eat natural amino acids gets switched off. They go through a genetic shift, and they can't do that anymore. So if you add a bunch of DAP and a bunch of yeast right in the beginning, you're going to create a massive population that isn't adapted to finish that fermentation. If you want to have reduction problems, stuck fermentation issues, do those things all at once. Add a nice moderate inoculum, plenty of oxygen, wait for the natural amino acids to go away. So say you're starting 24 or 25 Brix, wait till 20, 18 Brix, something like that, before you start making your nutrient additions. And then continue to add oxygen all the way through the ferment. So again, slow down and take it easy with those. And again, oxygen, if you're going to rack or if you have some reduction issues, it only temporarily relieves or reduces wine. You have to solve the underlying nutrition issue. What's causing that? And that's one of the reasons we use pantothenic acid in wine. We talk about problem solving. Pantothenic acid goes into the pathway. It's called the acetyl-CoA pathway. And it goes in and switches off the ability for yeast to make hydrogen sulfide. So if you want to keep reduction to a minimum, that's where that vitamin, that B vitamin comes in, pantothenic acid, because it turns that switch off. So if you want to know why we're adding that to wine, and it's really frequently in a lot of the yeast nutrient blends like the fermades and the superfoods and things like that. But if you just add it directly, that can really help. So if you're going to try and fight, fix reduction, really make sure that you're adding plenty of nutrient and plenty of vitamins and plenty of oxygen. And all those things mixed together really help a wine. As a matter of fact, a DAP addition and an oxygen at the same time is like supercharging a ferment at 15 or 10 Brix. That's super, super helpful to help get those yeast over that hurdle to finish that ferment. All right, quick definitions. Macro-ox. Macro-ox is the technique of adding micro amounts of oxygen to the wine in order to oxidize ethanol into acetaldehyde. So when we micro-ox a wine, this is usually done primarily before the completion of ML. A lot of times wineries will do primary fermentation, and then they will take the wine and chill it, hold it at 40 to 50 degrees, which is below what a malolactic bacteria like to work at. Get it through primary, and then you go ahead and do your micro-oxygenation, because Oxygen dissolves much easier into solution at cooler temperatures. And we do this in a wine that has no free sulfur. And after primary fermentation, there is no free sulfur because the yeast make acetaldehyde, they bind it up, and then there's no free sulfur. So this is when you mox, is right after primary, hold the wine cold, and you add a little bit of oxygen, and that directly drives oxygen to acetaldehyde, which then helps us knit our tannins together. And this is that window between post primary and pre-mallow. So if you're looking to assemble tannins, this is the way to do it. And in massive wineries where they're using oak adjuncts and big tanks, this is the only way to travel. Let's talk about macro-oxygenation. Macro-ox is the adding large, uncontrolled amounts of oxygen to a wine during crushing and primary fermentation. This process generally occurs during primary fermentation and basically has effect on yeast health, but little comparatively on the wine matrix. So what we're doing here in macro-ox is we are adding a blast of oxygen to stir up the tank, give the yeast a free ride around the tank, give them some oxygen to breed with, and we're really looking to create an optimal environment for the yeast. We aren't worried about phenolics in macro-ox. We're just trying to create an environment where the yeast are really, really happy. And this is what we do when we just shove our big stone in there and bubble the tanks over, or you maybe do a pulse air and roll the tanks or something along those lines. This is just where we're adding lots of oxygen through a venturi or a big, oxidative pump over as much as we can to try and get oxygen there to help our yeast out. In order to make these type of macro-oxygenation or micro-ox, you need to have the right kind of stone. So for macro-ox, here's some places you can buy them. Davison Winery Supplies, St. Pat's of Texas, and Glacier Tanks all offer these. And these are where you go buy these big stones, hook them to an oxygen tank, and just give them a blast of oxygen. And this is where you buy them. And if you ever want to just kind of oxygenate your wine while you're fermenting, this is the way to go. But again, totally uncontrolled. This is just a nice way to make our wines feel good. And this is sort of a touchy-feely, almost artistic way of looking at wine, is just giving our yeast some health and paying attention to them and making sure they're doing the best they can. Now, when we get into Meso OX and Micro-ox, you can buy these little diffusion stones. And generally, if you're going to do Micro-ox, you have to have a system. And I'll talk about the systems that you need to have. But the Meso OX that we do in barrel, which you guys are all familiar with, we go ahead and strap one of these little stones to a tube or something like that. And virtually any homebrew supplier, Amazon, you can buy these anywhere. And you hook these up to an oxygen tank and add with a flow meter, just let a little bit of like 1 to 2 milligrams a liter of oxygen flow through the stone. And what we're doing is that we're bringing to the barrel. And at this point in time, we're doing a few things. If primary ferment isn't done in barrel and we're in that still that early stage, we're trying to bring enough oxygen to ease the yeast into their grave. The other thing we're trying to do is we are attempting to kind of stir up the barrel again, get the yeast to move, and perhaps while we're at it, if we're at the end of ferment, we're mitigating any reduction issues. We're blowing off hydrogen sulfide, literally blowing it off. It's coming up and leaving the barrel, and many of you experience that with some of your ferments where they got a little stinky at the end, and that's really common. It's called end of ferment effect. At the end of the yeast life, they get kind of mad and they get stinky. It's just the way it rolls. So it helps fix those reduction issues at the end of ferment. And lastly, there's probably some amount of oxygen at that point in time, especially at the end of ferment, while mallow is going on or pre-mallow, that you're going to get a little bit of oxidation of ethanol into acetaldehyde. And so kind of depending on your timeline, doing a little Meso OX, you're going to get a little bit of tannin modification. So I want to do a quick idea of Macro-ox. So when you don't have an oxygen regulator and you don't want to buy one, you don't have an oxygen stones, and there are some options. This is Tommy Bigelow, and here he is doing a delistage. And so what we want to do here is take a look at, we have a situation where we're blowing wine up in the air into a sump and then pumping it over, and that helps to get oxygen into the system. So macro-oxygenation during fermentation, again, consideration, phenolics, mostly winemaker hubris. How much polymerization do you need? Syrah and Grenache, you don't need a whole lot. You've got tons of color. You've got very little harsh tannin. You don't need a whole lot. But those wines, because they're high color, have a natural tendency towards reduction. So if you want to fight that reduction, oxygen is a really good way to do that. But on the other hand, you've got Nebbiolo and Sangiovese, which have a high need for some sort of polymerization because there's a whole lot of tannin and very little color. The problem is that if you overshoot the amount of oxygen that you add on these wines, there's nothing there to mop up the acetaldehyde at the end, and you can end up having to dump a ton of sulfur into them. So we also have to think about how much can a wine accept. Syrah and Malbec, you can shove oxygen in them for days. Just pump them open. But so really early on with Syrah and Malbec, anything with a high color variety, give them a ton of oxygen. Very little worry on that. The other side though is Nebbiolo and Sangiovese. Again, these high tannin, low color varieties. I probably almost even include our Tempranillo in this, where you've got a huge amount of tannin, but a moderate amount of color. So if you keep pumping the Macro-ox, sure, you'll get all the acetaldehyde in the world, but then what can happen is that you don't have any place to put that oxygen or that acetaldehyde, and you can end up browning the wine out. So anyway, that's all hubris. During primary fermentation, it's pretty impossible to oxidize a live ferment. Give the yeast all they need. So let's go ahead and combine Macro-ox and punch downs to break up the cap. This is something that we do. You guys have done this plenty of times. So here we are, pumping some oxygen into the tank and breaking up the cap. This is all very familiar to all of you, and it's kind of a college seller's standard production. So there's another way to get oxygen to a tank, and this is the process of removing wine from a vessel in a highly oxidative environment. A lot of times wineries rack a whole lot, and mainly it's to clarify, it's for people that don't want to filter their wine. And in some cases, they might rack 5-6 times a year. And I find that really interesting that you would do that. I'm not sure that's necessary. If you want to get oxygen to the wine, bring an oxygen stone, stick it in the barrel, and give it some oxygen. I'm not sure you got to rack all the time. And since we go ahead and sterile filter all of our red wines, we don't need to worry about clarifying them. So we bring oxygen as needed, just with a cart and a little stone, because it takes about 2 minutes a barrel to bring a little oxygen should you need it, versus all the time it takes to set up and rack a barrel. Some other things that people do, and this is kind of old school traditional, is what they would do is they would rack the wine out, and then while they're pouring the wine back in, they would literally pour it through the bung, and they would burn a sulfur wick and pour the wine past the sulfur wick to pull the sulfur into the barrel and make a sulfur gas add and minimize dissolved oxygen in the wine. So this is something they used to do. Racking is really uncontrolled. And I think it's something you're going to do. You got to be really careful with it. You got to know your wine. And if you have the capacity to rack a whole lot, go right ahead. But at the end of the day, all you really end up doing is chewing up a lot of SO2. So the advantages, it adds oxygen, but who knows how much it does. But you can be variable amount of oxygen. Do you splash rack it? Do you use inert gas? Things like that. If you're careful, it removes solids. As long as you're racking off the bottom, you got a nice little space between the bottom of the racking wand and leaving the solids behind. The other side of route racking that's really nice is, in our small winery, we can go through barrel by barrel and analyze. But in big wineries, you might have 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 barrels of a single lot. And so making 5,000 individual barrel additions can be really time consuming, whereas it's a lot easier to rack all 5,000 barrels to one tank or 1,000 barrels to one tank, and then go ahead and do the chemistry on it, make any adjustments you need, and then bring it back to the tank, and you get a nice homogeneous process. Another thing about racking is it blows off any dissolved CO2, and by not racking, occasionally some of our reds end up a little spritzy if we don't blow them off later, but we'll talk about that during bottling. And also, it's a simple process, especially if you use gravity. You don't need anything, and we'll talk about how you do that. Disadvantages, you don't know how much oxygen you're getting unless you're measuring it. It removes yeast, and is that a good or bad thing? Having yeast around can be a good thing. They're a great oxygen sink. They provide texture and flavor and polysaccharides and richness to a wine. A lot of people are leaving their red wines on lees and go ahead and stirring them to give that fatness and richness that you get from yeast lees. But if you do that, then those yeast are essentially little balls of protein, and they end up finding the wine. So you could end up removing tannin. The other side is it's messing, it's time consuming. And then every time you touch a wine, anytime you penetrate that bunghole, there is an opportunity for spoilage. There's an opportunity, if that wand isn't perfectly sterilized when you insert it, it's gonna bring something to the barrel. And so every time you do that, it's just, a chance for something to go wrong. So some critical control points where you have to do it. At the end of fermentation with no active lees, there's really no protection necessary. Once you're done with primary ferment, it's okay. Rack it, splash it, it's okay. There's going to be plenty of microbes around to suck it up. You might rack a wine 1 to 10 times in a wine's life. Most of the time, once you move through those first initial rackings to blow off sulfides or anything like that, you're going to have to continuously add SO2 during those rackings. So a lot of people add 10, 15, 20 parts every racking, needed or not, just to make sure that's okay. And then some wineries who are looking to minimize oxygen use a bulldog and blanket the barrels with inert gas on rack and return. And this is called a bulldog pup. You can buy them, and what it does, it locks in the barrels, and then you inject the barrel with nitrogen as you pump out. So that way, no oxygen gets to the wine. And essentially, when you're making a really delicate wine like a Pinot Noir, a really oxidated racking could just destroy that wine. And realistically, when you're making these really elegant, pretty reds that are very low in tannin, very low in color, you have to treat them like a rosé or a white. So be very careful when racking, and so you can minimize some oxygen pickup by using inert gas. All right, here's Meso OX. This is what you guys are very familiar with, and this is that idea of using a tank and a flow meter to deliver a measured amount of oxygen with a diffusion stone. So Meso OX is in the middle. So we have Macro-ox, where we're just adding uncontrolled amount of oxygen. And then Meso OX, what we're doing is what we're trying to do is we're trying to add enough oxygen during that post-primary fermentation state to change its sort of electrochemical potential to move the wine from a reductive state to an oxidative state. And this is really important to do because a wine will go through sort of a phenolic shift where if you add that oxygen in that critical phase, you will create a wine that actually has more ageability later on if we add that oxygen right after primary ferment before malo is done. And so we want to do that, and a little Meso OX is an easy way to do that. Some people just simply rack the wine, get all the solids off, and rack it a couple of times. That's an easy way to do it. But the reality is that Meso OX with a stone where we add it in a controlled way is a really easy way to bring a very specific amount of wine to a specific amount of oxygen to a wine to prevent reduction and blow off hydrogen sulfide. Meso OX can be formed on a wine that has some free sulfur. And so like if you're aging a wine and it's just got a little bit of hydrogen sulfide, but not a whole lot, you can literally go in with a little oxygen and blow it out and just get rid of it. And then the oxygen will react with hydrogen sulfide, won't react with your SO2, and you can add that. And the reality is it would be something around, 1 milligram a liter, 2 milligrams a liter of dissolved oxygen. You just have to run the stone up to whatever level you want, know how many liters you've got flowing through the stone, and that'll tell you how much to add. If you look in the SOPs, you'll find a Meso OX SOP, and you guys can take it and use it to scale it to your winery size. So Macro-ox, the upside is it's 1 to 2 minutes a barrel. You can get the same effect of a rack. You can create a racking with 1 to 2 minutes a barrel. You can get really good precision with the stone, so you can really laser in what you need to do to your wines. You can manage reduction with it. You can induce some tannin polymerization, not a whole lot, but some. Again, it doesn't remove yeast. So if you wanted to do that sort of more Rhone style where you've got lots of yeast lees and things like that, you can do this and minimize reduction by meso-oxing throughout a wine's life. So this is all the way from primary fermentation. Even once you've got a sulfur add, you get a little funky, you can come in and add a little oxygen, that'll balance it out. It doesn't remove yeast. But in a Bordeaux wine where you're looking for a really framed wine, you're not looking for that sort of fat, squishy thing where you're looking for these really polished, square, abrupt tannins. If you take the yeast out of the equation, you're not going to get that. You're going to end up with a more fleshy, rounded style. And so, good or bad, I don't know. Disadvantages, you better have a good meter, a DO meter, and know how much you're adding. You're going to have trained staff that aren't just standing there, chewing the fat, and the next thing you know, they've oxidized your Malbec into coffee. And the downside is it doesn't clarify your wine, whereas racking does that. You get that clarity, whereas if you're just doing this, you're going to end up unclarifying your wine. All right, Macro-ox. This is the key to big wineries. And you cannot do Macro-ox without a machine. Can't do it. We don't have the technology at the school. We don't have tall enough tanks. You got to have an 8-foot tall tank. There is a new thing called a wine grenade, which has a little silicone diffusion stone, which is pretty cool. And in that case, you can add a little bit of diffused oxygen into a barrel, and it's not a barrel by barrel situation. But for the most part, you got to buy a system from someone. There are a whole lot of companies out there that do it. Oxbox, there's one from Juclas up here. They're all over. And what these do is these add a very controlled amount of oxygen. And so we've got a few things that we can do with Macro-ox machines. Number one, if you have a big winery, you can ferment in a wine with a Macro-ox system and just turn on the Macro-ox system. Just turn it on. During ferment, you Macro-ox. And in a 20,000, 50,000 gallon tank, you can throw some oak and chips in there and get a really similar flavor profile to using that of barrels. The other thing you can do is once you get to that primary ferment and you're still in that giant tank, you chill the wine before mallow, and you can turn up the MOX system to produce acetaldehyde. And you'll go smell the tank and it'll freak you out because it smells like sherry. But that's exactly what you want, because at that point in time, the wine's cold. It's going to minimize acetobacter production. And what you're doing is you're creating that acetaldehyde to knit those tannins together. And then you're doing that in conjunction with all those aldehydes from the oak, and you mix everything together, and you can get a really reasonable flavor profile that's similar to using barrels for a fraction of the cost. And again, it's very important to have the right kind of system. But this is the upside, is that you can shave the cost of wine from what would be in using a barrel. A new barrel is going to cost close to $3 to $4, maybe even $5 a bottle in just barrel cost. This can be reduced to 10 cents a bottle, and you could have a very similar flavor profile. And you can see why large wineries work like this, because you do this in a tank, one tank, you go through primary, you press it, it goes back into another tank. So you're going to 2 tanks now, it's all you've done. You chill it, you take it through MOX, and boom, you've got a finished wine, and then you just filter it and bottle it. And it's pretty fantastic in terms of cost saving. The advantages, super precise. You can replace barrels, huge cost savings, and you can use it. The disadvantages, it's not sexy. Barrels are beautiful. People like to look at them. I like to lift them. It makes me feel strong. And it's expensive up front. MOX boxes are not the least expensive thing in the world. You got lots of little oxygen hoses running everywhere, and you got to figure out how to use it. You're going to have to get trained on how to use it. You're going to have a dedicated system just for that. And again, tanks have to be tall enough to fully dissolve O2 before reaching the top of the wine, because when you add these little tiny bubbles of oxygen, you won't see a bubble on top. It completely diffuses into the wine. You're looking at pure diffusion. So it doesn't, you've got to have a tank at least over 8 feet tall. So this is why large wineries do this. And again, this isn't going to help with any yeast autolysis. This is a giant tank. Any yeast are on the bottom. But this is a really good way to create high quality, high flavor wines in a tank without ever using a barrel. Okay, barrel aging. You hear about this all this time. So the Macro-ox that occurs through the staves and blah, blah, blah. Well, Linda Basson's done a lot of work at this at UC Davis, where they measure the oxygen ingress based on the thickness of the staves and everything else. And it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. Of course, winemakers will swear up and down it does, and they age faster, whatever, I don't know. But generally, probably not through the staves. Mostly through the bunghole. But what does happen in thinner stave barrels, because they are thinner stave, they evaporate quicker. So you've got to top more frequently, which means you've got to open the bunghole more frequently, which means that's where the oxygen's coming from. So a thinner stave barrel doesn't necessarily let more oxygen in. It evaporates more, and you've got to top it more often. So therefore, you're getting more oxygen in the barrel, but it's probably not through the staves. The topping is most important, though. So if you're going to barrel age a wine, you've got to top regularly. Every winery is different in its need to top. Depends on how humid your barrel room is. If you're around 80 degrees or 80% humidity, you won't have to top very often. But if you're around 10, 15, 20%, like I was in Colorado, I would lose about 2 liters per barrel per month. And so over the course of a wine's life, in Colorado, we would go to barrel at 15.2% alcohol or 14.2% alcohol and come out at about 15.5 because of how much water we would lose and how much topping we would go through. So again, topping is really important in order to minimize Acetobacter. Acetobacter oxidative. If you kill those little Acetobacter off by topping, they just drown. So topping is really important, and that also minimizes direct oxidation. So polymerization of tannins, well, it sort of depends. And I think that a lot of the polymerization of tannin that happens in barrels happens strictly due to all the aldehydes that are in the barrel, not because of this oxidation effect that's happening, but all these, furfuryls and vanillic aldehydes and things like that we talked about in oak. I think those are some of the things that are really inducing some of this tannin polymerization. It's not necessarily traditional, straight up acetaldehyde from oxidation of ethanol. It's just coming from the barrel itself. And then the other things that happen too is the temperature. The hotter or colder it is, it speeds up and slows down all of these things. So in winemaking and generally across the board, always think of temperature as your throttle. The warmer it is, the faster things are going to happen. The slower it is, the cooler it is, the slower things are going to happen. And lastly, SO2 status. Once we get up about 30 parts free SO2, 30 to 35 parts free, regardless of the antimicrobial effect, talking to Steve Price, who's a great phenolic chemist, it really shuts all these things down. So if you're running 35, 40 parts free, that really slows down any polymerization of tannin. So if you're looking for polymerization of tannin, running lower SO2 amounts will help that, but at what risk? And generally, I will say this over and over again. If you don't have your tannins pretty well set up by the time you're done with mallow, there isn't going to be a lot you can do to change them other than something along the lines of concentration or refining. So in conclusion, oxygen is integral throughout a red wine's life. Controlling the timing is so important. During fermentation, do whatever you want. Dump it from bin to bin, splash it, rack and return, do whatever you want. Give those yeast all the oxygen they need. Give them some love. They're working hard for you. Do everything you can to make them happy. After primary fermentation and pre-completion of mallow, controlled O2 okay. I mean, moderately controlled O2 is okay. Bring a little Meso OX, that's okay. Make sure that you're, helping those, if you're going to get some acetaldehyde, that's okay, because that's when your tannin modification is going to happen, but it's got to be done before ML. But once ML is done and you're in that barrel and tank aging, you've got to have very controlled oxygen. You want to add just enough to offset reduction, if that's the case, and you want to add just enough to keep that wine from kind of going into an ugly state. So during barrel and tank aging, it's just a very controlled amount of oxygen. And primarily if it's in a barrel, you're going to get that through the topping process. If you do get a little bit of reduction, you can come in with some Meso OX and clean it up. But primarily, that's it. Very controlled once you get it into tank. As soon as you got a wine under sulfur, everything has to be really smart and really controlled. So let me explain it this way, and let me close with this. All of the precursors, all of your building blocks for a red wine are made in the vineyard. Everything that you do from the second that vine goes through bud break to leaf strip and open up that canopy to develop tannins, develop color, and do all of that kind of early on in the canopy management. And then and choosing your harvest timing, all that stuff that's going to buy you and build you, make all of your building materials. Okay, so everything you're going to do to build your house, everything you're going to do to build that beautiful red wine is coming in a kit from the vineyard. But the way that you assemble that and the way that you put it together is by using a combination of alcohol, temperature, and oxygen. So alcohol is our solvent that's drawing all of our phenolic material out of the grape. That's pulling it into solution, holding it in place. Temperature is what drives the speed of that extraction, hotter or colder, just like making a cup of tea. And then the way that we assemble those tannins, the way we build that structure, the way we form up our tannins and our structural makeup of the wine is with oxygen and acetaldehyde, and indirectly through its path by creating acetaldehyde. Oxygen is the driver. And so this is a great tool for you to be able to build the structure of your wine. And when we do the practical tasting with our red wines, I think you're going to really see where you can use oxygen to push a wine one direction or another. And it was a long time in my career, probably 20 years in, when I realized that my job as a red winemaker was really acetaldehyde management. That was what drove and controlled my whole palette for building a wine. And the way we control that is really frequently with oxygen. So if you want to build a wine, understanding how oxygen works in that matrix is really key. And now on to practical reds.